Hello and welcome to Cranfield University. In this interview series, we explore the role of philosophy and humanities more broadly in management, engineering, but also in our everyday lives. My name is Andrey Pavlov and I'm a professor of strategy and performance at the School of Management.
Hello, my name is Toby Thompson. I'm a studio director. I'm principally interested in the philosophy of executive education coming out of the continental tradition.
And our guest today is Dr. Lou Marinoff, professor of philosophy at City College in New York and the founding president of American Philosophical Practitioners Association. Lou, welcome. Welcome to Cranfield.
Thank you very much, Andrey and Toby. Pleasure to be with you.
Lou, can I just ask, can I just go in with the with a very direct question, I suppose. We're really interested in bringing philosophy to our everyday life and to bringing philosophy to the practical professions, so to speak. And of course, philosophical practice is something you've spent years developing. Can you tell us what philosophical practice is to you?
Sure. I can give you a kind of a loose characterization of philosophical practice, which to us practitioners is an umbrella term, language being very elastic. The precise terminology could differ from nation to nation, even among Anglophone nations, for example. So there will be synonyms. But philosophical practice is an umbrella term, just as, for example, medical practice or psychological practice or legal practice is an umbrella term that, in fact, covers implicitly many, many different kinds of specializations. So similarly, in philosophical practice, one would find people who are philosophical counselors. Counseling is a main component of that, mostly one-on-one interactions or one-on-two. One could then also identify facilitation. One works with groups, either informally in cafe philos or with more formal methods, which we can talk about later. And ultimately, one could also speak about philosophical consulting, although in the UK, sometimes consultancy is a synonym for counseling. So again, you have to parse the language. But for us, consulting specifically means doing philosophy with organizations. And so this becomes more complex because one has a hierarchy of needs and also of constituents, stakeholders within an organization. So it involves the delivery usually of more than one kind of service over time. So one can think about a practitioner being a counselor, a facilitator, or a consultant. Also, this is an educational service. Philosophical practice is not medical, not legal, not psychological. So as an educational service, it could also entail bringing philosophy into the classroom in a more moving way to make it more relevant for our students' daily lives, as you suggested earlier, Andrey. And it also entails another large wing of practice, which is philosophy for children, P for C, and this is rather a separate movement because it's generally under the aegis of education per se and not so much run by philosophers, but philosophy for children is certainly a form of philosophical practice since children are active inquirers, and it brings philosophy as a live inquiry, not as a dead subject. Into the everyday classroom for younger children too, which I think is a wonderful thing. So you can think of all of those activities as forming part of what might be called philosophical practice.
And Lou, what does it actually look like? What's a session looking like?
What does it look like when two people are having a dialogue?
Yeah.
We're having a dialogue now. If we were going to discuss some personal issues in a philosophical light, then it would look very much like it looks. We don't diagnose. We're not reading X-rays or MRIs. We're trying to look more into the soul, or conduct an inquiry through the mindscape of the client. But basically, it's all done through the medium of dialogue, even when it's informal. And as well, when there are particular methodologies that one might be following, the medium is still dialogical interchange, exploration of ideas, and so forth.
And does philosophical practice presume that the practitioner is a professional philosopher or accredited philosopher, or can you say that anyone who is engaged in a philosophical inquiry is to an extent a philosophical practitioner?
You know, Socrates didn't have a degree, to my knowledge, since there was no university in the Agora. It was his student Plato who founded the Academy, and Aristotle, you know, the Lyceum. But so we're a bit ambivalent on this, and you'll pardon me if I remain ambivalent on that question. It's a good question, but one that may not be satisfactorily answered for your viewers. So just let me say this, that most of us, and again, I don't speak for all philosophers at all, nor all members of APPA. We're in, you know, what the New England Transcendentalists called of themselves. They said we're a society of like-minded people, no two of whom think alike, which is, I think, a wonderful way of putting it. We believe, if we share one overarching view, it's that philosophy can indeed have utility in everyday life, but exactly which system or which philosopher is up to the individual practitioner, indeed up to the client. So let me just say this, that we don't think that governments have any business regulating thought and speech. So governments ought not to be regulating philosophy in the way that very sensibly they regulate medicine or law or engineering or indeed clinical psychology. Now, those things ought to have some oversight to prevent harm to people and to ensure that the service providers are trained to a certain standard and that they continue to utilize best practices and so forth. So professional development is important in every profession, including ours, but we don't think that government should regulate philosophy. So we have developed internal standards. And we do believe that on the one hand, anyone can call themselves philosopher. I don't see a problem with that. Toby, if you want to go around saying you're a philosopher, I'll accept that at face value. I'm not going to challenge you. But on the other hand, we think that service providers who want to call themselves philosophical practitioners are, like any professional, acting not only in their own interest, but also as representatives of a profession. And therefore, they ought to be able to adhere to a kind of minimum standard, both of academic preparation and a professional practice. So we have a demand that in the APPA, at least, the people who want to be certified as practitioners have at least an MA in philosophy, you know, or MPhil or PhD, as the case may be, and that they have some training which enables them to render a service that's reputable and efficacious.
So, Lou, are your clients presenting with philosophical issues, or is the cadre of philosophers that you're talking about just there identifying an issue? What presents?
What presents sometimes is a specific philosophical issue, especially if someone has read one of the many books that are now out there. Andrey, you mentioned Plato, not Prozac. That was a game changer, I think, for the movement and for me personally. But it was really a door opener that both made the general public aware that there are such things as philosophical problems that people carry around, and that indeed sometimes the person you really want to speak to might just be a philosopher as opposed to a CPA or a barrister or a psychologist, or for that matter, you know, a priest, minister, or rabbi. I mean, people have hosts of different kinds of issues in life at different stages, but people will often recognize that they have a philosophical problem, sometimes not. Sometimes they may just feel some kind of existential angst or some kind of malaise. And indeed, in an ideal world, there ought to be a thorough medical workup for everybody who has a complaint, just to make sure that it's not a physical or medical problem. But in the real world, that rarely happens. You know, it turns out that something like 10%, I believe 10% of psychiatric cases are actually undiagnosed neurological problems or other kinds of medical problems. People present with things, and then because of this phenomenal tunnel vision that all specialists necessarily develop, we immediately assume that anybody on our radar has the kind of problem we're trained to handle, but that's not always the case. So sometimes philosophers are gatekeepers too, and we need to be very careful about identifying the sorts of issues that we believe we can help with, and also recognizing when people do and do not bring those issues into the consulting room.
And from your experience and your practice, what would you say? How does a person come to the realization that they have a philosophical issue and could benefit from a philosophical consultation, for example?
Well, a lot of it comes from the case studies that they read about, and they may identify themselves as some character in Plato Not Prozac or Therapy for the Sane or any number of the dozens of wonderful books now that my colleagues and I have produced for the general public. So they may recognize a problem. It could be a midlife crisis or a relationship issue, or something else. Career change is a big one. And so they will sometimes try to exhaust the usual avenues of better established or well-established professions, but sometimes that's not satisfactory. And so if there's something that lingers, they may, some people will turn to a philosopher as a last resort, and that's fine too. And that's also, we can work with people as they present themselves. But they're at this stage in our development, most of our clients are self-selecting. In other words, they've heard about this from a friend, or they've read about it in a book or an article, and they want to give it a try. So they're very good on the whole. In my 30 years of practice, I would say 95% of the people who approach me for an initial consultation are indeed suitable as clients. 5% are not. And I refer them.
How do you make that distinction? What allows you to say, well, this is you're probably not quite there for this, or this is not quite for you?
Yeah, this is an important question, Andrei, and one that is absolutely not ironclad. But we have a scope of practice. I've developed a scope of practice many years ago that passed muster with the Institutional Review Board at our college, and has since been replicated in a number of public and private universities, both in the US and abroad. So like any other profession, we can describe the sorts of things that we're able to work with, yeah? And they would be, for example, moral dilemmas or ethical quandaries. That's straightforwardly philosophical turf. They would be dealing with issues of meaning or purpose or value in life. Now, there can be some overlap there with other professions that counsel, but philosophy is in the West, at least, the original source of such guidance, and as well in Asia, too. If you look at Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, Indian philosophy, the ancient sources are also sources of counsel. So there's that. There are issues of belief systems. Inconsistent belief systems can produce something called existential dissonance, or the psychologists call it cognitive dissonance. So what is knowledge? Again, the core of epistemology is the proposition that knowledge is justified true belief. And we all need beliefs to get through the day, but some of them are better founded than others. And philosophers are really ideally trained to be able to examine belief systems and expose inconsistencies and help people make modifications if need be. So that's another area that we can handle. I guess another important area is essentially dealing with any kind of life-changing situation that prompts the person to seek some kind of philosophical explanation. People want to understand things. Philosophers sometimes understand things very well. Sometimes we misunderstand things very well, too. But again, a dialogue is not harmful. And I think that the main thing that people need to realize, certainly your viewers should realize, the bottom line, as we say in the US, is that the institutional review boards that have to sanction any research done with human subjects, whether it's invasive, in medical terms, or whether it's just talking to people, could be educational. But the Institutional Review Board is constituted by federal statute in the US, and one of their main raisons d'etre is to ensure that all risks, if any, are made known to the participants in advance, so they consent, and that they are therefore, in a certain sense, protected because they're giving informed consent, and also that the researchers are protected because it provides a very strong layer of indemnification for people doing research to have subjects fully informed and mature age-wise and signing off. What the IRB determined in the case of philosophical counseling was that there are no risks. Now that's actuarial speech. There's always risk. There's a risk when you get out of bed in the morning. There's a risk.
Right.
One could slip and fall. Yes. One cooks breakfast. There's a risk of burning something.
Let alone speaking to a philosopher.
Okay, so you understand this.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
basically, speaking to a philosopher is regarded as being in the lowest risk category.
Interesting.
And this is a wonderful thing. Because it completely and flatly contradicts some of the original brouhaha. When we first emerged in the 90s and got publicity for doing this, there were naturally concerns that were raised by some of our let us say sister professions or even sibling professions like psychotherapy, which grew out of philosophy. And they were immediately, some of them, viewing us as competitors in a turf war. In the US, there are rivers of money that stream into healthcare, and people want to camp out on the bank and scoop up their share. So they regarded us as poachers on their turf and tried to panic people initially into suggesting that one of the most famous instances of this was someone who suggested that a client of a philosophical counselor might jump off the Brooklyn Bridge with a copy of Plato Not Prozac in their hand. Of course, this would panic any university administrator, wouldn't it?
I got a question, Lou, about resolution of issues. And you know as well as Andrey and I know that Socrates was executed because he was talking truth to power using philosophy. So you say there's no risk, but you could conceivably have a consultation of some sort and the person then goes out and dissents in some way, which could be quite damaging for the organizational context in which they're in. Say more about that risk.
Yeah, well, now we've entered into a very interesting area. Fortunately, this almost never comes up in practice, but if it does, we're prepared to tackle it as follows. Most professions that dispense counsel of any kind the professionals have a primary responsibility toward their clients, but also have a secondary responsibility toward society. And operationally, that means that if someone were to come into a session and threaten to harm someone or say they were intending to harm someone or do something otherwise illegal, criminal, or harmful, we have a duty to report. All licensed professionals have a duty to report to their respective governments or police forces when someone comes in to threaten harm. That's never happened to me in my practice. It's never happened to any philosopher I know. But it has happened in terms of civil disobedience. I remember teaching a course in environmental ethics one year, and this was out at University of British Columbia in the early 90s. The students were very keen, some of them, on protecting old growth forests, which in British Columbia are being slated for the slash and burn thing that's happening all over the world. I think it's a crime against nature. I think slashing and burning old growth forests is a crime against nature of which humanity will repent for many reasons. So the students were concerned with what kind of ethical position they could take to protest. They didn't want to sabotage equipment because that would be criminal. And nor did they want to spike trees, a very dangerous thing. Doesn't harm the tree necessarily, but a lumberjack cutting into a spiked tree can encounter the spike with a chainsaw. It could then recoil and injure or even kill the wielder of the saw. That's criminal potentially. So my advice to them was to engage in nonviolent protest. They ended up chaining themselves to trees. That was fine. They weren't doing anything criminal. They were maybe trespassing if at worst, but it slowed down the cut and burn because people had to then come and cut the chains and, police had to come and take them away. But they were not doing anything criminal or harmful. So I think that one, as a philosopher, needs to be able to assess the bounds of civil disobedience and the grounds on which civil disobedience is justified. We have a long history of that, starting with Socrates.
Can I go back for a second to this question about how people come to and how people discover philosophical practice or philosophical counseling? It's interesting you said that most of the people come to you because they've read a book or they've read a case study or they've heard about you and about the practice itself. But correct me if I'm wrong. This is not how it started. Is that right?
That's right. It didn't start like this at all, but it's rather idiosyncratic. There were a number of pioneers going back to Pierre Grimes in Southern California, who's now 98 years old and still practicing. He's the founder of the Noetic Society. He established a method called, which he calls Socratic midwifery, which comes straight out of Plato's Theaetetus. It's the idea that people walk around with false self-beliefs, things about themselves that are untrue, that have been ingrained in them by peers or parents or teachers, and that these things cause roadblocks in their own lives. And the way to liberate people in order for them to fulfill their own potential in an excellent way is to remove these internal roadblocks. Now, that might sound a lot like psychotherapy. I've done this on open line radio. I've used philosophical midwifery sometimes with people who phone in. And I remember one host on open line radio listened to a little bit into my interaction with the caller and said, "Lou, that sounds like psychotherapy." And I said, "Well, you know, it is. And the person who invented this particular style is Plato. So pardon me, a therapist in ancient Greece is an attendant, simply an attendant. So the valet parking person is actually a car attendant or a vehicle attendant. You know, the psychotherapist is supposed to be attending to the psyche. Well, what does that mean? Psyche translates in many ways into English, and primarily in Greek, it's breath. So your meditation teacher is a psychotherapist. Your flute teacher is a psychotherapist. You have to breathe well to play, to play any. So that's all, pardon me for now, ruffling psychology feathers, but basically the word therapist has been appropriated to mean a certain thing, but in fact, it's a much more generic term. There's music therapy, art therapy, and all kinds of therapies, both on the scientific and the humanities-oriented side. So back to your question, the original clients who came to me were not people whom I sought, and I would not have called myself at that time a philosophical counselor. I was working in a research facility called the Center for Applied Ethics at the University of British Columbia. And as you well know, applied ethics was, in fact, a branch of philosophy that became very successful as a growth industry because it was needed.
Sure.
And we were in the media quite a bit for, and still is, absolutely, absolutely. It tends to be reactive by its very nature. In other words, we need unfortunately, some sort of catastrophe or at least scandal or at least something has to go awry. And then we can have some case studies and conferences and discussions and foment some positions on the issue. And then ultimately, this will influence public debate and regulation and legislation. It's a very important industry. And of course, it's applied by definition. So we were in the media quite frequently because as applied ethicists, we were offering sound bites on various issues, be it business ethics or environmental ethics or medical ethics and so forth. So it was the ordinary people, the civilian population got the bright idea that maybe philosophers could speak to them about more personal issues as well. If we could speak about generic things like the environment and business ethics and abortion and, genetic engineering, well, excuse me, these are issues because people have them. From an applied ethics view, it's a generic thing, perhaps, or a general case. But it's people who walk around with the specifics. It's people who walk around saying, should I do X, Y, or Z? Should I have an abortion? Should I euthanize grandma? People have issues. So my first client was a call-in, a principal of a high school with a moral dilemma on the job, phoned in the center and said, can I speak to a philosopher? And I happened to be there and took the call. And that was my first case. We resolved this in one conversation on the phone. The second case was a walk-in. A graduate student walked in and wanted to discuss a personal matter of prioritizing values in his life. So we had a couple of sessions about that. And through that work, I realized that we needed to somehow develop protocols because there were obviously needs out there that weren't being met. In Canada, like the UK, has a very generous national health system. It has, it has a social safety net. But even so, sometimes people want to talk to a philosopher. So through that, we formalized protocols for rendering this service pro bono in the Center for Applied Ethics. And then I came into contact with other pioneers in Canada, the US, Europe, and elsewhere. And we eventually had the first international conference in 1994 and realized that it was really a movement. So it's only about 30 years old as a kind of a modern or postmodern emergent movement in philosophy.
It's incredible, Lou, what you're doing. Back to my point about truth to power. I understand that you're a speaker at Davos. I'd love to hear more about that.
I'd love to tell you more about that. We could consume easily the hour talking about the World Economic Forum. I should immediately tell you that I have not been to Davos for quite a few years. I've been on the faculty of the forum since around 2000. It's more than 20 years. And it was primarily because of Plato Not Prozac being reported in The Economist. The book you mentioned became an international bestseller. I think it's in 27 languages and still is a bestseller in many countries. Now, if one gets reported in The Economist, there used to be a column called What the World is Reading. And if your book lands in there, you'll get called by a lot of different people, including the World Economic Forum. I was very fortunate and privileged to be vaulted into those circles where I was able to meet and work with not only Fortune 500 CEOs and Nobel laureates, but also political leaders, religious leaders, and entrepreneurs of many kinds. So it was an education for me, primarily from my own personal point of view, tremendously mind-expanding, world-expanding education. But also, it was Elie Wiesel who really convinced Klaus to open this values domain, because it was originally just business meetings, and just as not pejorative. I mean, business people have to meet and should meet, but it was also important for them to consider the values side of things, and to try to build a better world in that sense, not just a more profitable world, but also a more harmonious, more peaceful, more prosperous world. So I would like to think that for that reason, there were various humanities representatives, and still are, in Davos. But gentlemen, I mean, the bottom line is that I became, I think, a little too politically incorrect at some point. Perhaps a pre-existing condition. But as some of these bodies become extremely politically correct, they tend to diverge a little bit, Toby, from my tendency to speak, as you earlier said, truth to power. That remains one of my priorities. Even if people don't want to hear sometimes what is said, it's important that they hear it.
And what is the message that you think bodies like this need to hear? So the World Economic Forum, I think you've also spoken at the Aspen Institution, and other think tanks. What's the message they need to hear, you think?
Well, the message is that we can't have a monolithic set of worldviews imposed on us. This is not globalization. This is authoritarianism on a global scale. The only reason why the world has developed so well, the developing world and the emergent economies have done so well in recent decades, is because they have, to a certain extent, developed best practices from the West's. And a lot of the West's successes are based on, it's been a slow and painful process. Yes, the Industrial Revolution was full of iniquities and injustices. And yes, Mill and Marx and Wordsworth, each in their own way, were right to rebel and to point out what its failings were. But only in a climate that tolerates freedom of expression and dissenting views can we possibly right wrongs. And what I see happening in the world is something much more dire. And it was exacerbated by the pandemic, unfortunately, where for a very short time, governments were acting by imposing quasi-martial law on their populations, whether it was necessary or not. But then they became, especially in the formerly freest countries, somewhat addicted to the power they were wielding. And I don't see this overall as beneficial to the development of individuals or societies. I think we need to have a climate of freedom of expression, once again, where dissenting views are encouraged. It can't just be a soapbox, at Hyde Park Corner. It's got to be in the classroom. And what we've seen is an epidemic of, I'm calling it a social cancer. Political correctness has been on the scene for a long time, but it has metastasized. And cancel culture is like stage 5 political correctness. I was fighting against stage 1 back in the 90s, but it's not been stopped. And in fact, in some respects, it's getting worse, at least in the US, clearly getting worse. So that's the sort of thing. One has to challenge every kind of regnant nonsense that is being spewed 24/7 on mainstream media. And as Bertrand Russell finally said in a very famous essay, you give him control of the education system and the army and the media, and he'll convince people that 1 + 1 = 3, and that water freezes when it boils, and so forth. You remember this great paragraph that he wrote. But it was a warning, it was a clarion call to encourage people to think for themselves. And I'm sorry to say that in the mainstream consumer market, based on what I'm seeing and experiencing, the phones are getting smarter, but the people are getting dumber. The purpose of education surely is to smarten people up, not dumb them down. And insofar as education dumbs people down, it's doing a great disservice to them and to our civilization.
This is refreshing to hear, Lou. You mentioned there Western centrism. I know you are involved and teach Confucianism, Taoism, Indian philosophy, and Buddhism. Say more about how that relates to the issues that people present.
Wow, you've really done your research, Toby, and I'm very impressed. So thank you for mentioning this. We have currently, and if one wants to refer back to Toynbee, for example, the classic historiographer who had his way of counting up how many civilizations there were. But according to his schema, there are really 3 that survived from the 20-odd or 25-odd that he identified in antiquity and in earlier history. But we have clearly Western civilization, which is endangered now in many ways and may not survive very much longer as we recognize it. Indian civilization is thriving as never before, still very recognizable. And modernizing, and because they've adopted some of the best practices of the West, including the great digital technologies that are available, they've been able to vault into another sphere of socioeconomic progress and growth of the middle class, and they've lifted dozens, if not hundreds of million people out of poverty without having to relive the Industrial Revolution just because of cell phones. So, I mean, the Indians are doing amazing things, but they haven't necessarily lost sight of their traditional philosophical roots, which are very deep and powerful. And the same thing of China, which is, of course, a world power and factory to the world now, and emerging as perhaps the dominant force in this century, depending on what happens in the West. But China also has very deep and very beautiful indigenous philosophical roots. So what we see happening in many countries is that modernization, industrialization, economic development, and postmodernism all together tend to conspire to make people forget about their indigenous philosophical traditions. And then philosophical practice assumes a new relevance. So here's this Westerner reminding Indians of the greatness of the Bhagavad Gita and how they should return to it. And they are. They've developed a society now, an association of philosophical practice in India, and they're collaborating with us to train Indian philosophical practitioners. Same thing happened in China in its own way. So they're talking now about clinical Taoism. They're talking about the cognitive Taoist therapies. So they are in parallel with what the psychologists tried to do. They're developing their own ways of counseling people based on recognizable indigenous traditions. So they're revivifying the philosophy that's been on the ground for thousands of years, but they're putting it into a modern and postmodern context. It's going to succeed. It's relevant and important.
So can I ask you to talk a little bit more about APPA, about the Association of American Association of Philosophical Practitioners?
Yes, of course.
How did it come about? What's its kind of priorities and goals and objectives, and what is it about really?
What is it about really remains to be seen. We're only 23 years old. We were
only 23.
Co-founded. I'm a co-founder in 1999, we realized that we needed some kind of vehicle to grow philosophical practice. Yes. And the formula, if you like, Andre, is that, I mean, what we've seen in the mainstream is that people read Plato, not Prozac, and then, or another book like it, and then they want to find a philosophical counselor. But philosophers read it also and say, wait a second, I'd like to do this. And so we have a whole group of self-identifying practitioners, and APPA was formed really to train aspiring philosophical practitioners in all of these modalities, be it counseling, be it facilitation, be it consulting. We train across the board, and also, therefore, to enable them to be service providers to those who step forward and self-identify as clients. So we needed a national certifying body to do this, and that's why APPA was formed, just as a vehicle in order to take things forward.
I would go so far as to say, Lou, that what you're saying there seems like an antidote to the phone culture. You talked about phones getting smarter, but people getting dumber. You also mentioned earlier on about kids and teaching young kids in education. Say more about the educational intent of what APPA and what you are doing.
Well, okay, and I have nothing against phones. I mean, I confess that I carry one. I mean,
Me too.
What do you do when people need to send you a verification code? You get a new computer, you can't log into anything, so that, you know, the developers, they have to have firewalls. And I only know one person who absolutely steadfastly refuses to own one of these, but he has a tougher and tougher time making headway. But life is not an app, and this is the thing. Right now we're seeing, and it really comes back to business ethics, if you don't mind me saying so, web development is running everything. The tail is wagging the dog right now. And if things work, just leave them alone. But no, these guys have to continue billing whoever's paying them, so they continue updating every week. No sooner do you learn to navigate a website, the next week it's been changed. It's the Wild West, basically. Governments need to regulate them, not because they're doing harm, but because they need to be regulated. They have to, if something works, don't fix it. You know, give us a chance to do what we want to do instead of updating us every 30 seconds and making us jump through all these hoops. So in any case, this is what happens when there's a new industry, and, you know, there's an evolution within it. It's governed by something a little bit parallel to natural selection. In biological domains, I call it synthetic selection. It sorts itself out. But back to your point, Toby, I think that Americans on average are spending something like 6 hours a day now on mobile devices. Wow. That's really scary. That's a third of their waking hours, if not more. And I think that these apps are basically hijacking people's consciousness. They're trying to compete for your consciousness and your attention. And attention spans are getting shorter. The literate culture is vanishing. We have all these apps now that write for us, be it Grammarly, that corrects people's grammar so they needn't learn any. And now the new chatbots, which are writing essays for people so they don't have to think for themselves. It's very scary. If people walk around assuming life is an app and letting apps run their lives, they're going to experience dehumanization. They're not going to realize what it means fully to be human. And I think that there's a lot of potential in the human being that's developed independently of digital technologies, although it can be expressed through them. But we have to return. I mean, our university, like yours, probably, is trying to prepare people for careers that don't yet exist, right? So how do you predict? How do you predict in engineering how to train people to do something that hasn't yet been invented, but that's going to have, you know, 10 billion people working in it, you know? And then, so how do you do this? Well, I would maintain that based on our long experience, and I mean going back to the beginnings of recorded history, that the surest way to enable people to learn a new technology and a new vocation or a new profession is to give them basic skills, to instill in them the ability to read, write, and reason. Well, if they can read, write, and reason, then they've got a pretty good chance to do all the things that haven't been invented yet. Unless we want to go down a different path and turn everything over to the robots and put ourselves out to pasture somehow, which I don't think is the best use of a human being.
So philosophy in everyday life, I think was what you call it, is a case of turning off your phone and entering into dialogue. It couldn't be simpler by the sound of it.
It is. It's so refreshingly simple. People find in a philosophical consulting room a safe space. I'm not using the word now in a different context because it's a space where they can reflect on things that they don't have time to reflect on normally. We're all multitasking through the day, and it gets very distracting, very dissociative process at times. So, how would you like to experience yourself as an integral human being, examining with somebody else who's trained to do an inquiry with you into your own circumstances in this case, just have an hour to sit down and reflect about your life and where it's going and where you'd like it to go. Why are you maybe not getting what you want from life, and why perhaps are you not attaining what you want to attain, or how can you do better? If you are successful, how can you even do better? This is all part of the purpose of leading the examined life. It's not a waste of time at all. It's the very thing that empowers you to live as fully as you can.
And do you think we can demonstrate the value of doing that to people, or do you think people have to come to that point themselves?
I think that not everybody wants to be philosophical. Again, if you're asking what philosophers do, it's a bit disingenuous, of Socrates to say he doesn't know anything, but he knows how to conduct an inquiry. And this is really important. He knows how to conduct an inquiry into whatever is on the table. And this is what we do with people. So if you look at university departments, you will notice straight away that psychology departments tend to be much larger than philosophy departments, although psychology is the child of philosophy. It's had a wonderful run on its own. It became established toward the end of the 19th century, and it's done amazing things, and it covers a huge spectrum of activity, both theoretical and practical. They're all but remember when counseling psychologists first emerged after the Second World War, really, the research psychologists were in the majority, and they pointed the finger and said, that's not psychology. And then when we emerged, it was the same thing. A lot of analytic philosophers pointed the finger at us and said, this isn't philosophy. So history repeats itself. But people, not all people want to philosophize. And maybe some people don't need to philosophize. And maybe if they get to know themselves psychologically, that's good enough for them. So this is not something that's forced on anyone. But I think that from our experience, if you look at Plato Not Prozac, it was situated in the self-help market. Maybe you are well aware that self-help was at the time the largest single segment of the book publishing market, maybe still is. It's branched out into a lot of things with Asian philosophy, and many, many other kinds of issues have crept into this market, and it's still probably huge. And it's also for mature people. When I was 18, gentlemen, I had very little interest in philosophy. And I think adolescents, by and large, have other things and better things that they need to do in their period of craziness and hormone, laced growth, and all kinds of things are going on. It's a big life change and a change into adulthood. But people in their 20s start to ask questions that they didn't ask when they were teenagers. And in their 30s and 40s, even more of those questions will come up. So I think that philosophy is there for those who eventually want to utilize it. But I wouldn't impose it on anyone any more than I wouldn't impose it on education, except I really think that there ought to be at least one compulsory intro course in every university. They're being eliminated. You know this, right?
Absolutely.
Philosophy is humanities are being targeted in favor of STEM. And I think that's a huge, huge mistake. We need STEM, clearly. We can't get through the day without technology anymore. But we are going to lose sight, once again, of what it means to be human. And this will translate into social and political problems. If people lose sight of their humanity, God help us.
I think this brings me to another question, completely different question that I was going to ask you. So you are a professional philosopher, and you also lead essentially one of these, this movement of philosophical practice. But at the same time, you're also a musician. You've got a number of albums you've recorded. You do photography. You've written a trilogy about the life of Fernando Sor. You're a champion, the table hockey champion of US and Canada. How is this all related? Where is philosophy in kind of in this whole mix, and how is it all held together?
Well, That's an interesting question, Andre, and thank you so much for doing your due diligence and looking at my website or whatnot. But I don't firstly necessarily see that everything has to be related. There are always post hoc connections that one can draw by looking at things. Oh, yeah, this is related to that. But entities manifest, things happen, and then perhaps we try to draw connections between them causally or otherwise. There's no necessary connection in my mind between philosophy, photography, music, table hockey, or anything else. I think that the people whom I admired growing up were people who were basically Renaissance men, people who were able to do a number of things reasonably well, maybe just jacks of all trades, but people who basically wanted to experience life across a rich spectrum of activities and reflections. So I began writing at the age of 5, and my mother greatly encouraged me. She was a poet, published poet, and she was thrilled that I wanted to write. She never, forced it on me at all, but she encouraged me, and thankfully, my father also encouraged me to play music. So I think that when we're young, we need to be encouraged to do the things that we're interested in. And if one is fortunate with one's parents or one's educators, then one will meet people who will encourage one to develop abilities if one has them. Everybody can do a number of things, and I think there's also a tendency in education to force people early into over-specialization, and that can be damaging to their overall persona. So once again, it's a question of time management. But if anything will be my epitaph one day, I guess I would like it to be Renaissance man, and I just live a life in accordance with that.
Lou, are philosophers born or are they made?
Or is it thrust upon them? I think that would be the other alternative. I think some philosophers are born very clearly. Others may discover it and then make themselves into philosophers, and others yet may have that thrust on them. I think any of those ways it could be equally valid.
So someone watching this video now thinking, you know what, I could be a philosopher. What's your advice to them?
Yes, that's a great question, Toby. And you know that one of my dialogues, I have a dialogue book published with a great Japanese Buddhist leader named Isaku Ikeda. And he and I developed this idea together while we were dialoguing that is also a common denominator between Hellenic philosophy and Mahayana Buddhism. And in a nutshell, it amounts to this. It also transformed the way I look at philosophical counseling. This is a decade-long process. So let me just give you the synopsis. In Mahayana Buddhism, there's this tremendous belief that the individual is awakened, or rather the individual has the capacity to awaken. Everybody does. We're born as humans with this great gift, this capacity to become more conscious and more self-realized, but that in people it's often dormant. It's latent or dormant, and our enculturation could, in fact, fail to awaken it. So the goal and the mission of Mahayana Buddhists is to help people to awaken. They therefore work for the happiness of others and become happy themselves. This Western model of so-called enlightened self-interest is often just self-interest, embellished with a kind of a veneer of enlightenment, but it's really just self-interest. And it sometimes, or if not often, fails to make people happy, because empirically, when one works for one's own happiness to the exclusion of all else, one very often runs the risk of becoming unhappy in the process. So Westerners are perpetually unhappy, and it's perhaps because we don't work enough for the happiness of others. The common denominator with Hellenic philosophy is Plato, again, and the notion of virtues being innate. Including wisdom, all these things are innate. So we don't regard our clients in general as people to whom we want to sell a virtue or teach virtue. That's this is the old sophistic way. It attracts the pejorative accusation of sophistry. But the root, is still wisdom. I mean, sophistication's a good thing, sophistry not. So the common denominator is that if we as philosophical counselors can help to awaken the inner philosopher of our clients, then they don't need us anymore. There will come a moment in a counseling process, be it one session, Toby, or be it 10, where the client will say something really important suddenly will emerge from the dialogue, that the client's inner philosopher awakens and then says something really significant. And the client hears it and says, my God, now I'm a philosopher. And at that moment, they're fine. And so it really can end. I mean, in the sense that a particular crisis or a particular problem or a process resolves because the client has experienced an inner awakening. And then they feel empowered to be their own philosopher and their own guide, maybe in conjunction with further readings or further identification with a particular school of philosophy. But that's the educational process again. So we can see this as helping to awaken the inner philosopher of our clients. It's a very beautiful way of explaining what we do. And I think that it's very effective and attractive to the general populace. If you have to see a solicitor, they're not trying to awaken your inner solicitor. They're trying to take care of your case. If you need to see a physician, the surgeon is not trying to awaken your inner physician. He's trying to fix what's wrong with you. And similarly, I think that many psychologists, if not most, psychotherapy is not trying to awaken your inner psychotherapist. It's trying to treat or somehow deal with whatever it is that's bothering you, affectively or otherwise. But philosophy is different in this way, because I try to get rid of my clients. If we can awaken their inner philosophers, they don't need us and they can get on with their lives. That's a good thing.
That's so motivating. If anyone's watching and thinking, that could be me, I'm motivated by that. Hopefully you are too. Lou, thank you.
You're more than welcome, Toby.
I was going to ask a different question, but I'm just going to sort of follow on this conversation. How long does a treatment take? You're saying you're trying to get rid of your clients. Are we talking about 3 sessions? Are we talking about 3 months? How does that work?
It could be. How long is a piece of string?
Fair enough.
The ideal short session is one. We do a 50-minute hour in New York. I mean, there's a reason for that. We usually, if you have back-to-back clients, you need 10 minutes to reset and to also look at the case notes. It's very important. Refresh your memory about what you're doing and who you're working with. But basically, it's a 50-minute hour. And again, some of my cases have been resolved in one session. Some cases, if it's a problem-oriented case, if it's time delimited and the client has to make a decision, one never decides for them, but one can help them to discover, again, their inner way of deciding. And this could be 1, 2, 3 sessions. I work with clients for 3 months, 6 months, as long as a year, but not in my case much longer. There are philosophers who prefer longer-term work, and that can be very effective. So I'm trying to say to you that it can vary. And I think that what we mostly do is to offer an initial consultation at which we try to determine whether this is a suitable person in terms of our scope of practice, earlier referenced. I always make some sort of evaluation. Sometimes it takes 2 sessions, but within 1 or 2 sessions, one can usually get a picture of the person's suitability and also of their willingness to work this way. And then one makes a recommendation to them. And again, in 5% or so of cases, I refer out. I refer them to a psychotherapist or a doctor or a lawyer or a Zen master, as the case may be, or indeed to a colleague if someone wants to do specifically existential work. I know lots of people who are much better than I at this sort of genre, and I'm happy to. You have in the UK some very strong existential counseling people, and I would refer them to that sort of person. One has to know one's own strengths and limitations as well. So that's the basic answer. It can vary from a single session to a protracted counseling relationship that could last months or conceivably longer. Although I think that in psychotherapy, and I have this from Irvin Yalom, who's a great, a very great psychotherapist. We have met many times. We became friends and colleagues after some initial misunderstandings, which were cleared up by dialogue. We had coffee in North Beach the first time, and we each had bones to pick with each other. But Irv said to me one time, he said, Lou, there's always something else, you know, when you're dealing with a patient or when he's dealing with a patient, even if he resolves the actual presenting problem or the problem that he's diagnosed, because he's trained to diagnose, he's a psychiatrist. But even when that's resolved, he's quite convinced that there's always something else that could be worked on. So I sort of jocularly refer to this as the first law of psychotherapy. There's always something else. And because there's always something else, potentially it never ends. I mean, so imagine poor Sisyphus is now rolling his massively unhealthy ego up the hill and trying to get to the, you know, to the summit of Mount Healthy Ego. But there's always something else that, you know, makes him backslide and makes him book more sessions. And so it's a lifelong process. And the longer you live, the more past you have, and therefore the more things conceivably that went wrong. And so the more things that could conceivably be the subject matter of psychotherapy. But that's really different from philosophy. We tend to work in the present going forward. And so sometimes there is nothing else. And at that beautiful moment, when there is absolutely nothing else, the person's fine, at least until something else crops up. But there isn't necessarily something else always there that needs further ferreting out.
No, I completely agree. But also, just to give us an illustration, if you could, what would be an example of a presenting problem that took a session or two and a problem that took 6 months?
Okay. Well, one can identify or distinguish rather between a problem and a process in the following way. A problem is often time delimited. Somebody has to actually take an action or fulfill a condition that's imposed on them or make a choice within a certain time frame. For example, I had a wonderful client who was a successful financial analyst, but very unhappy with that career. And she really wanted to get accepted to medical school. And in view of a social life, she was in her late 20s at this point. But she spent weekends boning up on her MedCat exams. She did all these pre-med courses and studied in order to get accepted to a medical school. And then she got accepted to one, but then she had a problem. Do I walk away from a pretty good career as a financial analyst and prepare to incur nothing but debt for the next 6 years, or however long it is, you know, until she's a real practicing MD? It's a long track. And also she also wanted to raise a family, and you know, that pushes another envelope, which we're getting better at pushing, but there are all these considerations. So her real problem was that she had 3 weeks to decide whether to accept the position that was offered as you know, a first-year med student, or to decline it. And that decision was by no means simple, and she wanted to talk to a philosopher about it. So she found me. And she's very rational, highly rational, which is sometimes helpful, not always, because sometimes our analytical engines don't give us the answers that we're looking for. If it's a personal life-changing decision, it's not just a question of writing a logical program. One has to consider many things. And we try to exhaust, through dialogue, once again, we try to exhaust the rational aspects of this, and it was equally rational for her to do either, really. There were good reasons to remain in her career, and there were good reasons for her. So I asked her a question, which she hadn't asked herself, and I think that prompted the process to conclude itself. I asked her whether she had this interest in merely being accepted to medical school. Is that what she was trying to prove, that she could get in? She wanted to badly enough, or did she really feel a vocation as a physician? And that made her think much more deeply, but she still wasn't able to come to a decision. So that was one session. In session 2, I invited her to do something that I invite people to do when rationality exhausts itself and we need to appeal to the intuitive side of our brains. I asked her if she'd be willing to consult the I Ching and see if there was anything in that text that would speak to her, because it's a mirror, and you're nodding your heads. I like that very much. It's an ancient book of wisdom. I've consulted it over the years many times. It never led me wrong, because it doesn't lead you at all. It's what I call the philosophical equivalent of a Rorschach test. A Rorschach test is a random ink blot, and you're asked to say what you see in it. Of course, there's nothing in it except what you put there. So it's very helpful for psychologists to tease out of someone's subconscious things which are on their minds that they're not aware of, and the Rorschach can help them to do this. It's a very powerful tool, yes, for this purpose. Whether you see a butterfly or a guitar or whatever you see, there's a reason for that which can be explored psychologically. The I Ching is a philosophical Rorschach test. It helps you determine what your deeper values are, where your moral compass and your existential compass is pointing. And certainly it's consulted at random, but that's in order to have equal random access to any of the 64 texts. It's a very rational process. So she said yes, she'd be willing to and interested to do this. She had never done it before. So she threw the coin, she got a hexagram, and sure enough, from the middle of that hexagram out sprang a very meaningful chunk of text to her, meaningful to her, that suggested to her that she was not socially or intellectually satisfied in her current environment. This was her telling herself that really she needed to make this change, although it took courage to make the change, yes? So we left it there. I didn't tell her at all what to do. I don't do these things, and that's in my consent form. I don't decide for my clients at all. But I help them to open a window on themselves. And she then said, okay, I think I know what I want to do. I think I'm able to decide. And she went off, and then some months later, I got an email from her saying, I'm in medical school, and I'm really happy I made this choice. So it was a successful encounter, I think, and it was 2 sessions. Now, on the longer term side, I remember counseling someone going through a very unpleasant relationship issue, which, was going to either be resolved or end up in divorce. And again, the client was indecisive about which way to go. But when you're encountering a process like a relationship issue or a life change or something, a process is open-ended by definition. So one can't simply say, okay, we'll paint by numbers and fix it in 4 sessions, or as the case may be. I counseled her for about 6 or 8 months, every couple of weeks. And as it turns out, she found a way to solve the relationship crisis and stay in her marriage, and was very happy having done so. So I was equally happy to have been kind of a companion to her on that part of her journey. And that was a 6-month counseling process.
Wow. Lou, we've been talking for more than an hour now. I'm going to wrap it up, but I want to ask you what your current interests and priorities are, and what APPA's priorities are right now.
Well, thank you very much for asking. Toby, as earlier mentioned, the pandemic has changed a lot of things in the world, and not all for the better. But one of the things that's happened, and I will say this with candor and not without enormous empathy for the people who've been devastated by this COVID thing. It's been horrible for a lot of people, a lot of professions, a lot of industries. It's causing a huge tectonic shift in economic terms and social terms and cognitive terms, perhaps certainly politically too. It's got ramifications, but it's not altogether bad for philosophers to be in solitude. For us, solitude is not a punishment. So the Fernando Sor trilogy was finished and written in solitude. Personally, I've been very, in a certain sense, grateful, not for the pandemic, of course, and the havoc it's wreaked. We've all lost loved ones, and myself included. But the ability to transform some of the nugatory aspects into something positive is once again a lesson that people need to focus on. So we are here on a Zoom call, and Zoom has accelerated manyfold during the pandemic. It's not going away. And because of moving everything to Zoom, APPA has moved its programs to Zoom, and we've become more successful as a result, because it's, of course, prohibitively expensive for some people to travel to New York, stay in hotels, and come to a 3-day program, for example, whereas we can do it on Zoom much more efficiently and globally. So our programs have flourished. We're conducting more than ever. And APPA's directors have, after a very interesting retreat last year, found ways to grow the demand and also to satisfy the demand. So we are transforming ourselves into a larger and a more outreaching kind of association. We're building an academy which will welcome people whose philosophical educations have been neglected by the K-12 system. We want to bring people back up to speed with being their own philosophers. And also we're growing and forming an institute that will develop, we hope, fruitful lines with our co-professionals in law, social work, medicine, psychology, and so forth, pastoral counseling also. We want to train more of them. There are many philosophical people out there who chose other professions just because philosophy is notoriously not economically easy for everybody. You know, there are many bad jokes about philosophers, and a lot of people do something much more practical because they would rather work for a living than contemplate in penury, and I can certainly relate to that. But we also want to satisfy neglected philosophical potential in all of these professions, because they encounter philosophical problems too.
Absolutely.
Among their stakeholders, and we want to help them better to deal with them. So APPA has, as a result, kind of an opportunity to shed its skin and to grow in many directions. So stay tuned, and we'll see what comes of it. But there's definitely a huge opportunity now, and we're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing growth in Russia, in China, in India, in Brazil, in the developing world, and in many other countries. And now there's interest from Africa. We're hearing from people who also want to develop philosophical practice there. So there's lots of work to be done.
Fair enough. And so as our interview is coming to a close, I'd like to ask a slightly more personal question, if I may. You have been thinking about these ideas for literally for decades. And I'm just wondering, what are you thinking about now? What is on your intellectual radar screen, so to speak? Or what are the books that are on your desk at the moment?
Well, thank you so much for asking. And the short answer is that I don't have room on my desk for all these books. I have a stack. I have a stack of books off camera. That's my reading list, and it's always higher. I can never get to the bottom of it, because no sooner, just one or two books get read than more get put on the pile. So that's wonderful, wonderful. But essentially, I'm becoming an administrator in my old age. I'm spending a lot of time with APPA more and more, helping it to develop its various new looks and appurtenances, and interacting with more younger philosophers and helping them to grow programs of their own, which we want to advertise on APPA's site and to get more people caught up. So I am doing a lot more administrative things, but also I have the opportunity to publish regularly. Right on my plate now is a novel, not by me, but by a very dear friend and mentor, former English professor and teacher of mine named Michael Godfrey, who passed away a few years ago. We found, his son and I discovered posthumously, a novel on this old disk drive that was in mothballs someplace, and he had never told us. Well, he had mentioned it, but we didn't know he had actually completed a novel.
Wow.
And it's just an amazing magnum opus from someone who was a great literatus in his day, an esteemed poet, published poet, and a teacher of Graves, Yeats, and Eliot. But he has given us a gift. And so his son and I have been editing this novel, and it's now very close. It's in the press. So that's a project which brings great satisfaction, because we think he would be thrilled to see it in print. And we're doing it for his memory, to honor his memory, and also to gift everyone with this beautiful, beautiful writing that he did. So that's a project that's meaningful, and it's not for money, it's for culture. So we'll see what comes of it. I have another project after that. Of course, there are always book chapters. I'm constantly accepting invitations to write invited chapters for books. So there's several of those in the mill, as well as a collection of my own essays that just came out last year.
Yes.
By Anthem Press. 25 years worth of essays on this very subject of philosophical practice, which had been dispersed across all kinds of different anthologies, but they're now collected. So I'm hoping that people will be able to get a real bird's eye view of my experience and trajectory in the growth of this movement through that collection of essays. And, there are more books. I think Ecclesiastes says that to the making of many books, there is no end. I just hope to have the time to continue to write and to be inspired to leave a written legacy. APPA's journal just surpassed the 3,000-page mark on our last issue. I founded the journal in 2005 and simply resolved that if people submitted essays and articles and book reviews, we'd publish them. And so here we are 18 years later. We're about to publish volume 18.1 in March, and it's going to be a special issue on philosophical counseling in India, based on a conference they held last year by Indian contributors. So this is a resource for scholars who are interested in theoretical and practical applications of philosophical practice. The journal's on APPA's page. You're welcome to have a look at it. Off-prints are there, as well as back issues. So this is what we do. The work goes on, and the world is in a place in which I think philosophy is going to have increased relevance in the coming decades.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Lou. Thank you for your time, but also thank you for giving us an opportunity to learn from your wisdom and from your experience of doing this for many decades. We certainly found it really enjoyable, and I hope you did too. And thank you again.
Oh, you're more than welcome. I'm very impressed by the amount of research you've done to ask such probing questions. And I also hope that your stakeholders, that your community of learners has some interest in this, and that they will also see the relevance of philosophy to business, and primarily to business, because, of course, virtuous organizations are not less profitable than vicious ones, and leave the world in a better place rather than a worse one. So I hope they will bear that in mind too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure to meet you.